Now, why do I think continuity of learning is protected? Is it just one of those education phrases? They come and go. There are so many of them. You can probably make a list as long as your arm. Is this just the latest kind of fad? Well, it might be. But the reason that you want a bit of new language is you want to disrupt the way people currently think about the world. What we do, and this isn't about what we do as individuals, what we do as a system for these children currently is not working. Let's face it, it's just not good enough. The outcomes for these children, on average, we want to change it. So we need to disrupt and change how we think about what we do. And that isn't blame, that is trying to understand how do we think again about what we do. So sometimes new language helps you think about it. And continuity, I think, quite is interesting because it throws up some opportunities to think differently about what I do. First of all, I know that good teaching demands good assessment. It's an essential but not sufficient feature of good teaching that you're good at assessing. Doesn't mean you're necessarily good at tests and all the rest of it. That is part of assessment. There's nothing wrong with that. It means that you just know your children well. It's impossible to teach well unless you know your children. Unless you know, we were in a meeting yesterday, unless you know, Kim was there from your team, she used that classic education phrase, unless you know how to get the teaching or the learning to the point, the zone of proximal development, the zone where the child is ready to make the classic Vygotskian concept, the known to the unknown. And as you get to the edge of what they know, you can support them across that next step in order to. And an assessment helps you understand that. It also helps you, of course, when you make a piece, when you achieve a bit of learning, to look back and ask the question, did they really learn what I thought? I always find planning at home really, really easy. They're brilliant. It's when I actually do it in the battle that it really gets difficult. How did they learn what I wanted them to know? And that's that has to be a classic assessment. I hardly need to say it, but effective teaching demands good assessment. So, continuity of learning for assessment is always going to be anything you're going to do to improve quality of education. You're going to have to look and consider assessment. It's impossible not to. The second reason why continuity is important is because when you look at any research and evidence, these points of shift in education, you might call them transitions, I can see Jane shouting at me right now, these points of shift in education, and sometimes it's a room to a room in an early years setting, an early setting to a phase, a shift from primary to secondary. Every time you measure the impact of those changes, the more vulnerable children, the children at risk, it's more challenging for them. It's when you get a kind of loss. And that's not surprising, of course, because those children are relying all the time on education for more and more of the support they need to learn, rather than any kind of capital and support they bring from the family and home. I always say, and I'm being a bit rude, but I can as a visitor, if you work in some of the most affluent schools in Australia, with the children who families have huge wealth and they've assessed the kids to get into those schools, pretty much if they're not learning, there's something wrong. Because it's easier to teach. What we're doing and what you're doing is harder to teach. That's not being sort of negative about the children, because more of the input has to come from us. So transitions matter more for these children. So everything we do matters more for these children. We carry a heavier load, and that means we put more challenge on ourselves. That's just the burden we've carried, because we want to work with the most vulnerable. The third is, and this is, I think, has changed in the last 20 years, we can be more and more confident as educators. We know more. The evidence is stronger. It's more accessible. Whether you're using something like the Education Endowment Foundation, Evidence for Learning, the work we do in Aero, the work that I know that the amazing stuff you have in Victoria when you're making choices about spending the marginal dollar for the more vulnerable children, the research is more available than it was 20 years ago when you had to go scratching around the library on a Saturday morning. And it was just the fact that it was written in language you couldn't penetrate, in books you didn't have, and about things that didn't matter. Apart from that, education research was great. There was a huge unmet obligation on research and academia, and I have part of my job is academia, to support the practitioner. We hadn't got it, but we're better at it now. That bridge is stronger, so we know more, and we can be confident now more and more about what matters. So I'll be really dangerous now and see if people start throwing things at me. Let's take early literacy in schools and the phonics war in Australia. What a waste of time. What a weird debate to have for so long. The evidence is crystal clear that good word and sub-word knowledge matters. It's an essential but not sufficient component of knowledge to support reading, and it matters more for more disadvantaged children. We've known that there's nothing we've known more about in terms of teaching than reading. The research is pretty strong, pretty secure, and yet people want to still go into ideological battles rather than just allow yourself to follow the evidence. And that's where I've gone in my life now. I will follow the evidence, even if it takes me to places where I didn't want to go, because that's my obligation. And I think that's almost the definition of a professional, that we're willing to follow the evidence and put our own prejudice aside. So if you're not following the evidence, what are you following? And you must be following your own prejudice. And the evidence, I think, is a better place to go. And we know more. We know more, and we're increasingly knowing more about early learning, about what matters and what doesn't. And I think that gives us confidence. We know that the pathways, we know that early literacy, language and communication, nothing trumps it. Most important thing is language. We know that self-regulation is a key predictor for long-term success, and we know that early maths is a high predictor. We know the things that really, really matter. And that means for us at Teaching Early Learning, in the communities we're serving, we begin to face questions about priorities. If we know that matters most, and it's going to matter more for these children, do we have to orientate our provision to really deliver on those areas if these children are going to thrive? And how do we do that? The concepts of broad and rich curriculum is our challenge. It's easy when the kids come reading. Teaching's easy then. We also know that learning pathways across phases, if you create good pathways and you've got good flight paths and they're understood, actually can accelerate progress. And remember, our job and our challenge is to accelerate the rate of progress. We've got to change this pace of learning for these children in order to get them closer to their peers, say at NAP Planet 3, whatever it is. And then the final one, and this is just such brilliant stuff that's happening in Australia. And when I read it in England, it was almost like a cheer went up from me. The investment that is now being made in early learning across this country is truly, you don't use it very often, but it is a potential transformation of Australian education. But it's absolutely fair for people to say, we must yield the benefit from that investment. And continuity, ensuring we get a better relationship between early learning and early school is the best way to make sure we get that benefit and yield it. Otherwise, there's a risk that you don't get it, and I think that would be a huge loss. So, the point we're going to move into the panel is important, because we're going to say this afternoon there's going to be, for the colleagues here from the settings and others, a more detailed, if you like, education examination of continuity of learning. But what we're also going to do now with the panel, which is great, is we're going to explore the relationships and the context in which you can make these things thrive. Because what I'm very clear about is, and our place is super clear about, is this isn't just down to the teacher or the early years educator to solve. It's about that being right, but in the context of a set of relationships where you've got opportunities for success. No one has solved the problem, by the way. If I could, I'd bring you the solution from other places to say, here's how you do it. No one has solved this problem. The best prospects seem to lie somewhere in a collaborative approach with an intelligent, adaptive framework, I think, and the support and challenge being well pitched. So in the work of our place, and if you're in a setting, the job of someone like me, I think, and all the colleagues who work in our place or in the government or whatever, is to support but also have the permission to challenge, and that's and that's within a culture of kind of respect and trust. But we have to have the edge. If we don't, we just kind of sink into a mush. So we need support and challenge in the right. That seems to be happening in the places where I see progress. People are up for the challenge as well as the support. The collaborations are happening across traditional boundaries, and I think. Increasingly, I'm clear they need a helping hand, a facilitator. It's not just the original structures of government and then just getting it right. There are new players. Our place is a new player. SVA does this work. People in England come in as an independent person into the existing relationships. And I think I'm seeing that in most of the places where you get success, and I think our place is filling that role here.